Saints, the celebration, is actually November 1st, but it's considered a movable feast. So here we find ourselves this Sunday celebrating it. And it's a reminder that we are all the saints of Christ. We are all the beloved children of God who are in the process of growing more and more and more into the image of Christ. It's that fancy theological term, sanctification, which means God is in the process of making us all saints. But it's also a time when today in the liturgy we'll remember the saints in our own lives who have died this past year, who we no longer see, but who we know rest in the eternal love of God. And we also consider the sort of great saints, the one who gets names, the ones who get, their names on certain Sundays of the calendar, certain weeks of the year. We remember their lives, not because they're better than us, but because something about their writings and their journeys teach us something about our journeys. And one of the great insights of the saints was that life and death are woven together. You see, outside of Holy Week, which is a time unto itself, this is really the only Sunday that has the concept of death built into it. We're remembering people who have died. The saints have died. And you know what? We too will die. And what I think sets apart the saints is a willingness to consider that and to know that a life well lived prepares us for a death well died. Now, our culture is not one that talks a lot about that. We'd rather talk about anti-aging creams or glorify youth. And even in death, we embalm people so that we look alive. We're not a culture that talks about death, but if you pick up Socrates or Aristotle or Euripides or our New Testament, what you find is a great concern for dying well. And when the saints talk about dying well, they're not saying that one should go around pulling gloomy faces all the time. The saints were joyful people. They're also not suggesting we go medieval and purchase a bunch of skulls so we can have our own personal memento moris everywhere we go. Your desk, your nightstand, hanging from your rearview mirror. It's not what the saints mean. The saints were joyful people, and they discovered that by living well, they learned how to die well. And they discovered that that was the heart of the Christian invitation, that that's really what faith was all about. Because if you read the New Testament, you'll see phrases like, "My life is now not my own. It has been crucified with Christ." Or, "Pick up your cross and follow me." Constantly in the New Testament, there is an invitation to death. Not literal, but a figurative death. To die over and over again to ourselves. To die to lesser ways of being. To die to the things that keep us from truly living. That the invitation of Christ is to let go of, to loosen our grip on all the tangible and intangible things we mistake for our lives. To die to being defined by perfection, or competence, or competition, or success. To let go and die to our own good deeds, our own sense of morality, our own having the right answer. To die to the fact that it's important to have a certain number of likes, or a whole circle of friends, or fame, however we name it. It's even to give up and loosen our grip and die to being defined by our own woundedness, our own losses, our own sorrows. The invitation is to take all of those tangibles and intangibles, the things that are done to us or happen to us that we think define us, the expectations set for us by ourselves or by others, the way we have to think we have to be a certain way for God to love us, to let those things be crucified with Christ, because they feel like they are us. But they aren't. Sometimes they're crutches. Sometimes they're layered on us and they've just buried who we really are. The task of taking up a cross is letting those things go in order to find out who we really are. Because for every death in this faith, there's a resurrection. For every piece of what we think is ourselves that we let go, we realize it's not the core of who we are. We were more than that. We could be more than that. And this is what the saints knew. They didn't know it because some revelation hit them from the skies. They knew it because they lived it. Their lives were patterns of learning to die and finding the new, and learning to die to something else to find the new. So let's pick a few, right? Just a few, because we'd be here all day, right? So let's go with Francis, a lot of people's favorite. Francis is born into a majorly wealthy family, and he's expected to carry on the merchant class, to be wealthy. But one day he's painting in a church, and he hears God calling to him to rebuild the church, not with his money, but to tear down what was happening in medieval Christianity. And so Francis dies to the expectations that he would be what his family wants him to be. He dies to the expectation that wealth equals success. He dies to whatever else he thinks he has to be, and finds himself reborn. That his calling was to start this mendicant order. It was his. And he starts this order that changes the whole shape of Christianity and what becomes important: death and resurrection. How about Hildegard? Personal favorite. Hildegard is poor, and she gets sent with a wealthy neighbor who she's the servant to. And the wealthy neighbor is sent to the monastery. They're both women. And they live in this dirt hovel for a while. And it's the neighbor who's called to the monastery. It's not Hildegard. She's just stuck tagging along. Mind you, she also has these terrible migraines. But it's over the course of time that actually it's clear that maybe the neighbor is called too, but the neighbor dies young. And Hildegard could go back to her old life, but she realizes actually she's called to the monastery. And she enters, and she realizes her headaches are actually the gateway to knowing God through her own suffering, death, and resurrection. And she realizes that whatever she was expected to do, get married, go back, live a life of whatever peasanthood in Germany looked like at that time, it wasn't going to be it. Instead, she was going to be in this order. And she had such remarkable gifts for leadership and for pastoral care. She was the only woman in all of Germany to preach in front of audiences of men. She wrote all this incredible music that I'm sure some of our singers have sung. She wrote an entire dictionary of herbal treatments. She was one remarkable woman who also stood up to the injustice in the church, see? But she'd never found it. She hadn't been willing to die to something lesser, to be born to something greater. And Ignatius, he thinks that the way to fame and fortune and the ladies is fighting. He is very gifted on the battlefield. But then one day he succumbs to an injury and an illness, and he's confined to his bed, and he will never fight again. And he thinks he's dead. Not literally, he will live, but he thinks he's dead. There is nothing left in life for him. No way to achieve success, no way to impress the women. It's over. Except that it's not. Because he begins to do some reading. And God begins to do something inside of him. And a year later, Ignatius finally leaves his bedroom. And he becomes this incredibly gifted man of prayer who develops the Ignatian exercises, ways of looking for God in our everyday lives. See, death and resurrection. And we could go on, but the saints practiced it again and again and again in their lives. And what happens when we practice over our lives this dying to the lesser thing? We find something new given to us by God replaces it. Who we were really supposed to be. We don't have to manipulate others. We don't have to use our anger. We don't have to go through the world trying to compete or prove ourselves. We can let go of that, and God can show us we're already of worth. We could do something much more valuable if we would just be who we are and be what God calls us to be in the depths of our spirit. And as we die and rise, give up the lesser to find the greater, it creates more trust in God every time it happens. And so when we come to the end of our lives, we've already known, as Ephesians says, the power of Christ working in us. We know we've trusted God with all of the small deaths and small resurrections of our lives. How much more would that be true at the end? And having known the power of Christ all of our lives, why would that abandon us in our death? And so to die well is to die as we have lived, trusting that the God who has been with us goes with us, and that death is the gate to a new life. Death is the gate to a resurrection. And the saints don't tell us what it looks like, and I don't have that answer either. But 1 John says, we don't know what we'll be, but here's what we do know. We'll be like God. We'll be made more and more into the image of Christ, which, as faithful people, we've been practicing our whole lives. And so perhaps this is just my own, flag in the sand or whatever that expression is, but to think about how we live and to think about how we die matters. It matters for our own selves. It matters for the people we love and care about. And I think it matters for our culture. Maybe one of the gifts the church can give the world is to not whistle through the graveyard. Is to learn to live well and teach everyone what it looks like to die well. Because dying well is an act of trust. It's an act of faith. It's an act of knowing that God has us in life, and God holds us through death, and God holds us beyond death. We are never without God. We are the saints of Christ. We are the children of God. And God, the power of God, is working in us to do more than we can ask or imagine, and that is the inheritance of all of us, starting now and lasting forever.